Hello, and welcome to this webinar organized by the Office of Corporate Relations at MIT, which includes the MIT Industrial Liaison Program and the MIT Startup Exchange. This is part of our continuing series on innovations in management. My name is Jose Ramos. I am a program director at the MIT Industrial Liaison Program Office. A couple of quick notes on kind of technical and housekeeping issues. So please use the chat for technical questions or issues. We may provide links through that chat as well. For questions to the presenters, please use the Q&A button, and we will moderate those questions and try to answer as many as we can. And so let's get started with our first presenter today, who is Professor Nelson Repenning, and he is a professor of management science and organization studies at MIT's Sloan School of Management. And Nelson is going to be discussing how not to manage in a crisis and a few tips for doing it better. Nelson, if you want to join us, and we'll take it away.
Great. Thank you, Jose. Good day to everybody. It is a pleasure to see you all, and thanks for joining us. So to motivate today's presentation, one of the things that my kids and I have been doing as we watch TV over the last few months is we have been making a list of phrases that we never want to hear again because they're repeated over and over again. And one of those is certainly that seems to start every COVID-related advertisement on TV is that we live in unprecedented times. That has definitely become a cliche, but sadly those cliches are often true. The times are unprecedented, and in particular, as we're going to talk about today, the novelty of what we are dealing with and what organizations are facing gives us an opportunity to learn new things about the culture of our organizations and hopefully to make them more effective. And what I hope today to do is to give you a little window into how to think about your organization through sort of the crises and the remote work that we are all dealing with, and then try to finish by both giving you a few thoughts about how you can manage more effectively given the unprecedented times that we are facing, but also some lessons that will hopefully endure when we finally return to some sort of normal sense of work. I'm going to try to talk for about 35 or 40-ish minutes. We'll definitely save some time for questions at the end. So save those questions and I'll do my best to tackle them when we get there. So the sort of central idea that we're going to talk about is crises like COVID definitely tend to bring out the best and worst of an organization's culture. So as I said earlier, a crisis tends to be a different lens that can allow you to see into the complexity of your organization in ways that might not be available to us in more normal times. And in particular, there's really two big things that have changed for us all as a consequence of the ongoing pandemic, which is, number one, people are being required to innovate and evolve very, very rapidly because we're all responding to things that were essentially entirely unforeseen. And then if that wasn't enough, we are all working remotely, or most of us are working remotely. And that combination of two things, which is having to adapt quickly and remote work, is definitely a big change for lots of organizations. And I think in some cases we are enormously more effective. I've discovered lots of ways to teach on Zoom, for example, that I actually kind of like, that I might use when we go forward. But there's also places where we devolve into some very bad habits. And so one of the things I want to talk about today, and I'm going to start with an example, is one of the bad habits that organizations can devolve into when they are both managing remotely, but also trying to adapt very quickly to a set of circumstances that were largely unforeseen. So to do this, I want to share with you an example of a simple little exchange that was shared to me by a former student. In fact, I've seen multiple versions of this recently, but this is, I think, one that's kind of the cleanest. And I'm going to ask you at the end of this and see if this looks kind of familiar and see what you think about this in terms of an example of organizational effectiveness. Okay? So it's a pseudonym here to protect both the innocent and guilty, but we will call my former student Jane. She works for a professional service firm that is being asked right now to rapidly adapt to remote delivery. So most of the work they did before was on site. And like everybody else, now that we're working remotely and working at home, they are very much trying to figure out how to deliver their services from a remote location in a way that they'd never really done before. Basically every consulting company, professional services firm, educational institution like MIT, we're all grappling with basically the same challenge. Okay? Jane is a junior member of the senior leadership team of this company, and the leadership team is meeting virtually about every 2 weeks because they're super busy right now, and they have a lot going on. So it's hard to make time for all hands meetings. Okay. Now, where this story starts is Jane identified a new technology opportunity that required a relatively modest financial investment to sort of prove out and see if it might help them do this remote delivery better. And it wasn't present in this year's budget because obviously budgets had been made prior to the time that we all knew that we were going to be working at home. Okay. And just to give you a little background, the first opportunity to use this new technology with a client was in 6 weeks from when the opportunity was identified. And if this particular technology turned out to be useful for them, Jane figured that there would be additional opportunities to use it, roughly spaced a month apart, and it actually could turn out, it was thought at the time, to be a bit of a game changer for them in terms of this sort of new remote delivery option that they were investigating. So, as I said earlier, the leadership team only meets every 2 weeks. Jane only had 6 weeks until the first opportunity to see if she could make this work. So rather than wait until their bi-weekly team meetings, she decided to do what we would all do, which is she sent an email to her colleagues in hopes of getting a authorization to spend this additional money that wasn't in the budget. Okay? So now let's do a little forensic analysis and see what happened next following the email. Okay. So first thing that happened is, so first off, I should have said before, she sends the email Monday at noon, okay, saying, here's the opportunity and here's the money that I need. What do you all think? Okay. So 24 hours later, the first thing that happens is the human resources vice president responds saying that there is no existing process for this out-of-cycle budget request, and further expresses worry that if they give Jane the money, it's going to set a precedent that any kind of random budget request can be approved just because it's unprecedented times. And then he further said that he was worried about general inequities in the budget allocation process anyway, and so therefore was very concerned about granting this request without some additional discussion. Okay? Almost immediately after that email, and Jane nicely shared with me this sort of full trail that you could see appended to each subsequent message, the finance VP, also a member of the leadership team, then chimed in and suggested that there was an existing process for such out-of-cycle approvals. However, she was worried that the process probably wasn't appropriate for the new world of COVID, and so therefore the leadership team should get together and talk about the general process of budget approvals so that they don't risk setting a precedent that they would then have to undo in Jane's case. The technology lead chimed in about 30 minutes later and said that there was an existing process. She was able to provide a bit of history as to how the prior HR manager had created. Sorry, I'm getting my genders mixed up here in the story a little bit. But he further suggested that Jane's proposed investment might be redundant with prior work that had been done in his function, but he wasn't totally sure. Therefore, maybe more conversation was needed. The CEO, the head of the leadership team, chimed in next and said that she had no particular view of the value of particular investment. That was kind of below her pay grade. But she was also worried about the precedent-setting issue because she didn't want to authorize the money and then be inundated with additional requests, and then it would sort of have to be walked back. So the issue of equity and fairness was a big deal here. Okay. Moving forward, the business development manager, whose area is most likely to be impacted, was completely underwater with another ongoing recruiting effort and didn't have time to reply. And I think actually you might not be able to see that one on the bottom of your screen. But again, business development manager didn't have time to sort of chime in. Okay? So now we are to Tuesday night. Okay, we are about 30 hours into this since Jane's original email, and everybody has responded except the business development manager. And Jane still doesn't have her answer to whether she can go forward with this project or not, and the clock is ticking. So Tuesday night, seeing that a request had made it around, Jane writes another note, making an attempt to summarize all the issues that had come up, and then requesting at the end of the note, could she please have a yes or no decision because the clock is ticking and she wants to move forward to try to, either sort of see if there's possibility here or just kill the project and move forward. Okay? Later that evening, the HR manager chimes in again, thanks everyone for their insights, and suggests that she and Jane should schedule a face-to-face meeting to discuss the details of the proposal, try to work through all the issues raised by the leadership team in the email thread. Following that, Jane realized that she screwed up, that in the haste of her initial email, she had forgotten to provide several pieces of context that were actually critical to justifying why this was an important piece of information. So she emailed the HR manager and copied the leadership team with all these additional details. And then again, I apologize, it seems like this might be cut off on the bottom just a hair. That later that night, so we're Tuesday evening, Jane and the HR manager scheduled a Zoom meeting, which they couldn't get done until Friday afternoon, which was roughly 5 days after Jane's initial request. When Jane and the HR manager finally had that meeting 5 days later, he approved the request and she was allowed to go forward and pursue the technology. So here's the box score. If you're sort of keeping score of this at home, it took about 96 hours for about 4 days from when Jane wrote the initial request until she got her money to pursue it. The request generated 12 emails. And again, I have them because I could go through the entire chain. I don't know how long people spent on each of these, probably some more and some less, but let's assume, I think generously, that each of those emails took about 15 minutes for each person to write and chime in. And the Friday meeting that she had with the HR manager that approved the budget took about 30 minutes. So you put these all together, there was about 3.5 hours of knowledge work required to make the decision. And even that probably is more than it required. And that meant that about 95% of the time between when Jane made the request and when she got the approval was just waste, dead weight time that was not needed. And so, in a fast-paced world where you're trying to adapt to a set of unprecedented circumstances, Jane lost about a week of development time and had 5 weeks to develop the technology instead of 6. Okay. Now, does a week matter? Well, 1 out of 6 is probably a big deal. And so, they lost valuable time in which they could have done another iteration or two to see if they could prove this out. Okay. So let's do a little poll. And again, this seems to be cut off. Does this sound familiar? Is this something that you all are dealing with, or does this seem like a kind of random example that is not happening in your organization? Okay, well, seems like we got pretty much overwhelming results here. About 95% of you said yes, it seems pretty typical. And those 5%, if you have any open positions in your companies, let me know because I might be interested in them or want to make an investment. And I could see Paul here says it seems pretty fast, actually. Yes, I would have to say this is by no means the most egregious example of this phenomenon that I've ever seen. In fact, I think it's actually quite typical and probably about average. Okay? And of course, the problem here is that in a world in which we need to adapt quickly, we simply can't afford to lose 10 or 20% of the available innovation time to dead weight loss because things are circulating sort of through the email ether. Okay? So what can we do about this? And how do we think about this? So let me connect this back to my research just a little bit, because of course that's what academics like to do. One of the things that my colleagues and I have been working on over the course of the last 5 or 10 years, and it was captured in some of the papers that were flashing on the video before we get started, is we have been developing a methodology. It's kind of a unifying framework for process improvement that we call dynamic work design. And underlying this idea of dynamic work design is really one we think pretty important, which is that when you think about designing your organization processes, they're really two complementary designs. And that's what we call the static design and the dynamic design. And think of the static design as everything you do before you turn a process or the organization on. Okay? I would imagine all of you at different junctures in your career have been part of major sort of transformation and sort of org redesigns. And if you think about the cartoon of how those happen, typically there's a senior leadership team, often aided by expensive consultants, and you sit in the conference room for weeks or months and you scribble different sort of pictures on the whiteboard and you kind of debate the relative merits of business versus function versus front end, back end versus matrix, whole bunch of different options. And then at some point you make a decision and you say, this is what we're going with. It gets instantiated in slides and procedures and so on and so forth. And then it goes out to the organization, and then you start working in this new way. Okay. Think of everything that happens before the day you start working in the new design as the static design. It's everything that you can plan in advance. And typically, if you're doing an org transformation, the most common artifact in the static design is just the org chart. I report to this person, they report to me, and so on and so forth. If it's a little bit more micro and you're designing a process, it's often a flow diagram that says, this is how we're going to make widgets or design new products or process invoices or serve customers or whatever you want. Okay? Now, the static design is super important, and all that investment is more than worth it in most cases. Okay? But as you all know, no matter how good a job you do on the static design, it's pretty rare and probably never that you get it exactly right? No matter how much foresight you have, things occasionally go. And that's where the second part of the design that we call the dynamic design comes in, which is the dynamic design is really all the little tips and tricks you have in your back pocket for how you accommodate the inevitable hiccups when stuff goes wrong. How do you accommodate to the things that happen when the static design is not perfect, or when your annual planning goes sideways, or you have an unprecedented set of circumstances? So if we go back to my little example with Jane, right? Nobody anticipated the need for this new tech because anticipate that we were all going to be working from home and delivering remotely. Okay. So there's nothing in the static design of their particular organization that says, how are we supposed to accommodate unforeseen circumstances? So the dynamic design that they have in this case is basically, how does she accommodate a problem? Well, in this case, she sends an email, and then we go through this sort of endless cycle. Okay? The central thesis of dynamic work design is that if we give some explicit design attention to how we accommodate problems in an organization and hiccups, which are inevitable, we can often make organizations work far better. Because the paradox of this distinction between static and dynamic is, whereas we tend to invest enormous amounts of time and energy and money in the static design, the dynamic design is largely implicit. Okay? And what I mean by that is we have it. We all have a toolbox of tips and tricks that we use when problems inevitably occur, but it rarely gets explicit design attention. In other words, we never really sit down and think about, hey, how should I respond when we screw up? We just do it. And all of you that are on this call or this webinar, you probably wouldn't be in the jobs that you're in if you weren't pretty good at responding to problems. But it's probably by instinct and apprenticeship and all that kind of stuff, rather than any explicit design attention. So what my colleagues and I have been working on for the last decade or so is, can we make that dynamic part of the design, how you respond to hiccups and problems, work better? Okay. Now, we've come up with this thing called dynamic work design. It has 4 basic principles of what we think good dynamic work design looks like. These are described in some of the papers that were posted earlier, and we have a couple courses at MIT about it. But let me just give you a quick sort of overview of those principles, and then we're going to do a deep dive into one, because it will help us sort of understand the pathology that Jane experienced. Okay? So what we believe constitutes well-designed dynamic work is, the first thing is that a well-designed dynamic work process does what we call reconcile activity and intent. Okay? And what that means, and it's pretty straightforward, is that if you are a well-designed piece of dynamic work, for the person doing it, the intent is clear, right? So this is true in all organizations. I should know the targets I'm after. They get regular feedback about whether the activities they're undertaking meet that intent. So I know whether I'm doing a good job or a bad job. And then where the reconcile part comes in is that in a well-designed piece of dynamic work, it's clear when I've missed. Okay, so I engaged in a set of activities. I didn't meet the target that I wanted. But there is a process for me to think consciously about how I might resolve that gap. Okay? This seems pretty straightforward. We would hope that people do this all the time, but it turns out we're kind of fighting the psychology a little bit, because when we respond to problems, in most cases, it's a kind of automatic or almost habitual activity. And we find that if you can get people to step back and engage in a little bit of a structured method, you can often make big progress. So principle 1, reconcile activity intent. Okay? Principle 2, which is the one that we're going to do the deep dive into in the moment, we call connect the human chain through triggers and checks. Okay? And what we mean by that one is, if you're doing a good job of principle 1, it means each person who's doing work in your organization, could be a frontline worker, could be Jane, could be someone in your R&D lab, they're getting regular feedback about whether the work they're doing is actually meeting the targets. Okay? What principle 2 says is, if there's a gap between activity and intent, meaning that what I didn't deliver my target, we have a rule that we call a trigger that says if that gap gets big enough, there's immediate notification of the person in the next level of seniority to say, hey, Jane's in trouble, we need to do something, okay? And it turns out it's really critical that that rule be established in advance so that I know that, hey, if I fall 5% behind my target, I need to tell my boss. Because what the psychology tells us is if I just say to you, hey, if you fall behind your target, I'm here, I'm your boss, I'm a friendly guy, call me when you need me. Without that explicit rule into place, people will almost always wait too long in order to notify the next person in the help chain. So having that rule specified in advance turns out to be pretty helpful. And we're going to talk about that in the context of Jane in just a moment. Okay? Principle 3 is what we call structured problem solving and creativity. This is the foundation of all the kind of process improvement methods like TQM and Six Sigma and so on. But the idea there is principle 1, we give people clear feedback on whether they're doing a good job or bad job. Principle 2 is we have a clear escalation hierarchy. Principle 3 is if we have a problem that gets escalated, what do we do about it? Well, problems represent an opportunity to learn stuff. And so in order to force that detour into conscious cognition and problem solving, we want people to use some kind of structured method to dig into the problem at hand. Okay? And then the 4th principle is manage what we call optimal challenge. And the idea here is that we believe in any work process, there is an optimal number of problems. And that number is in most cases not 0. And the way to think about this is imagine in your job, if you could get everything done today perfectly by 2 p.m, is that a well-designed job? Well, it might be great for you because you get to cut out early. But if you can get everything done without a hiccup perfectly, then you're probably not learning that much. So what the optimal challenge principle says is we need to find a way of putting in enough tension, or push into the system so that occasionally we do miss our targets, we do have to escalate problems, and we do have to engage in structured problem solving, because that's how we learn stuff. Okay? Now, most organizations, it's not that they have too little challenge, they have too much. And so, in a past ILP talk, I talked about this a little bit. It's described in the paper. But finding ways to manage that challenge level to get that sort of right optimal level is really important. Okay? But now what we want to do is to sort of understand the sort of pathology that Jane experienced. We're going to do a deep dive into principle 2, which is sort of connect the human chain through triggers and checks. And so to do that, let me go back to sort of very traditional organization theory very quickly. If you were to take an organization design class from me or any of my colleagues at any business school, one of the things they teach you very early on is something called contingency theory. Okay? Contingency theory is a really simple idea, which basically boils down to match the design of the work to the nature of the work itself. And specifically, contingency theory tends to preach 2 kind of extreme designs or 2 ends of a continuum. If the work is highly routine, I'm making widgets in a factory, or I'm processing invoices or expense report, meaning that it's very routine and we can predict exactly the steps we need, then contingency theory would tell you to use what was originally called a mechanistic design, which is basically you design it exactly like any modern factory, which is we specify the task very, very clearly. And as it moves from one person to the next, we make sure that handoff is really clearly specified so the person that's downstream from me knows exactly what I do and knows exactly what they're getting. Okay. And again, lots of work is designed this way. And then way on the other side of the continuum is that when the work is highly uncertain, I'm designing a new product, I am treating a patient case that I've never done before, or I have a complicated customer complaint. Because we can't specify that work in advance, that we want to use what originally was called an organic design, which basically boils down to we want to put a bunch of smart people in a room, let them operate as a team, and don't put a lot of constraints on how they work because we can't really foresee the problems that they're going to try to solve. Okay? So if you were to put this into a kind of schematic, you can take contingency theory and sort of map it into this little picture, which is imagine we have a continuum of work. Some work's highly precise, easily to specify in advance. Some work is highly ambiguous and we don't really know what's going to happen. And we can design that work in 2 different ways, right? We can design it serially, like an assembly line in a factory, or collaboratively. We can put everybody in a room with caffeine and chocolate and let them collaborate. And then basically in this sort of scheme, all you have to do as the would-be work designer is pick the box. The work's highly precise. We're going to design it serially with really clear steps. And if the work is highly ambiguous, designing a new product, we're going to put everybody in a room with toys and whiteboards and so on and so forth, and let them collaborate until we get a good idea. Okay? And so for more than 60 years, this is what we taught. And your job as the would-be work designer was to pick the box. right? Figure out what kind of work it is, precise or ambiguous, and then choose the right design. Easy. Okay? Now, I taught this, my colleagues taught it. Again, it's been a sort of standard piece of business school teaching for many, many years. Okay? And it is a powerful framework. But several years ago, I had an experience that many of you have probably had your own variant of that really caused me to revisit this in a quite fundamental way. I was taking a tour with a colleague of a factory in Nagoya, Japan, that's a supplier to Toyota. Okay? Now, I'm a super factory nerd, so my colleagues and I were really kind of wandering around, looking at everything in some detail. And one of the operations that we stopped at was the main assembly operation where they were assembling trunk latches. And this was an incredibly well-designed piece of work. There was a single operator. She was wearing cotton gloves, and she was doing a really complicated assembly in basically a minute apiece. And it was like a ballet. Every movement was perfect and scripted, and she was able to get this really complicated thing done really quickly. I was very impressed. And this would be, as good an example about what happens in that factory box on the lower left as you could come across. And I imagine it took them years to get this sort of optimized to that level. Okay? So, perfect example of contingency theory, works highly precise. Let's pre-specify and just have people execute the task over and over again. However, and this is a kind of classic anecdote that every sort of scholar of Toyota has repeated, while we're watching, what happens? Something goes wrong. She's not able to get the assembly done in the allotted minute. Now, what does she do? Well, you all know the answer to this. If you've ever sort of read the mythology of Toyota, what she did is she was supposed to pull the andon cord and stop the line. Now, in this facility, it was actually a button rather than a cord, but same idea. She hits the yellow button. Okay? What happens next? Well, supervisor comes running over. They have about a 1-minute conversation. Turns out that the material had been delivered wrong at wrong orientation. They solve the problem. She hits the button again, turns the light and the siren off, goes back to work. Okay? And again, every person who's ever Toyota has their own variant of this little story. Okay? But what I realized in that and on the long flight on the way home is that we've been teaching this wrong. Because what I taught and what all my colleagues have taught from contingency theory was you have to pick the box. Is it factory work or is it studio? And then you just put people in that. But of course, that's a simplification that's not really accurate. Probably all work is a mix of some routine elements and some non-routine elements, and that we probably need a different design for those two different contingencies. What I would have told you before this trip is that what made Toyota Toyota was their ability to design really precise work in factory mode. What I would tell you now is what actually makes Toyota Toyota is that they have learned a way to cycle back and forth between these two designs on an as-needed basis, right? As long as that operator can get that trunk latch done on a regular basis, fine. Don't touch her. She's in the zone, right? But the moment that something goes wrong, that factory design is no longer adequate because some uncertainty, a small amount, has crept into the system, right? And what happens when she pulls that andon cord or pushes the button is that now the design is temporarily changed. The supervisor walks over, they're now in studio mode, they have a meeting, they solve the problem, and they go back. And so now what I would tell you is what makes Toyota Toyota is not that they are so good at factories, although they are very good at that, but the real genius is that they have created a system where they move back and forth between factory mode and studio mode on an as-needed basis, right? And that rule of if I can't get it done in time, we call that a trigger, right? And the moment that she couldn't get the trunk latch done, that was a trigger that moved them temporarily from individual work to studio or collaborative work. And the big insight here that once we sort of figured this out is that once you think about it this way, your job as the would-be work designer changes quite fundamentally, because in the old sort of version of the theory, your job was to pick the box. Now, in this more dynamic view, your job as the would-be work designer is to define and design the rules that move you back and forth between individual work and studio work. Toyota is really good at this because they've been at it for 50 years or more, probably 70 years at this juncture. But what we've found is that getting people to think about it this way allows them to plan their meetings and design their work far more effectively. Okay. But now let's go back to Jane, right? Because if you remember, her senior leadership team was only coming together once every 2 weeks because everybody was very busy, right? So they're only moving back and forth between factory and studio. We call this a check, by the way, the frequency of check-in meetings. They were only moving back and forth between factory work and studio work every 2 weeks, right? Well, in a crisis like COVID, which is unprecedented, maybe that's not frequently enough. So when Jane can't afford to wait 2 weeks for a decision to move from her individual work to the studio work, what does she do? Well, of course, she sent an email, exactly like we would all do. Okay? But it turns out this is highly problematic because what the research tends to show here is that when we have to resolve ambiguity, right? If you think about Jane's request, that's a fundamentally ambiguous request. It's something that's we've never done before, we don't have to do. When we have to resolve ambiguity, by far the most efficient way to do that is to have a face-to-face meeting. Okay? The moment that we start using electronically mediated communication for ambiguity reduction, we get trouble, right? And so when we try to have ambiguous work that is organized serially, we call this phenomenon ineffective iteration, right? And what you see in Jane's case was the iteration was all these multiple emails with different people throwing their own perspective in it, and it becomes much less efficient than if we could have just gotten the team in the room to have that discussion. Let me give you another example of this. A couple of years ago, I was giving a version of this in one of my classes, and as I'm talking away, a student in the back, I can just see his face fall. And I actually thought he was going to start to cry. And so I stopped class for a second, and I won't use his name, but I said, Joe, what's wrong here? You don't look very happy. And he said, you're describing my life. I said, okay, well, tell me a little bit about it. And it turns out that he was a product manager at a tech firm. And the way their product development process worked was that in order to launch a product, they had to get 3 VPs to sign off. It was a technical manager, a manufacturing manager, and a finance manager. Okay? But it turns out that these 3 people at that point didn't really get along that well. And so what poor Joe had to do was go to each office and try to get their approval so that he could launch the product. But of course, these 3 people never agreed. So all Joe did all day was run around between these 3 offices, and then at night on email and chat, trying to get these 3 people to converge. Right? This is a bad design, right? And this is kind of an extreme case, right? Because what you see, of course, is the solution is we need to get those 3 VPs in the room, and they can't be allowed to come out and have lunch until they make a decision, instead of devolving to this ineffective iteration, right? And that's exactly what happened to poor Jane in this case, which is a decision that should have taken probably half hour or 45 minutes to make, because it's now happening via email due to the fact that we're all remote and they're not meeting often enough, is now suddenly taking much longer than is necessary. And as one sort of diagnostic for this, look at the number of decisions that you and your leadership teams are making via email, and look at the length of the email chains. My colleague, Don Kiefer, who I do a lot of this work with, when he was a practicing manager, had a rule in his organization that if any email chain got to be more than 4 messages, he would send an email to all the participants and say, get off email and have a meeting, because that's a far more efficient way to resolve ambiguity than to try to have all this stuff sort of propagating through the email ether. Okay? So let me show you another extreme example of the kinds of changes you can make once you understand that we need this cycling in between individual work and group work. So this is a former student of mine, and she was the chief financial officer at a small oil and gas company. And one of the things that they needed to do every quarter, various sort of regulatory financial authorities, is they needed to justify their reserves. So if you're an oil company, the oil that you have in the ground that you own is an important part of your asset base. It goes into your financial statements. And it's kind of a complicated process to sort of put them on your books in terms of what you think is out there, because you're basically valuing an asset that might be 25,000 feet underground, and the geology and the petrology is very uncertain. So there's a lot of documentation that goes in there. Justifying reserves was the most hated process in the whole organization. And you can see at the bottom, 75% of the engineers and accountants who quit that company stated that the reserves process was the reason. Okay? So look at this photo. You can see they're all in the office together. This is obviously pre-COVID. But if you look at the photo, what you'll see is they're all on their computers, right? And what are they doing? Well, they're doing work, but they're actually also emailing each other. So again, this is kind of an extreme example. Even though they're co-located, they are still having a lot of important conversations via electronically mediated communication. So they're in that ineffective iteration box, even though in this case, they're actually all in the same room together. So what my student did, which I thought was a very clever intervention, it was a project that she did for one of my courses, is at one point she finally got frustrated and she said, we're getting off our computers, right? They created a really simple pencil and paper process, no email. First thing they needed to do was each go individual brainstorming. One of the things that they needed to do in this reserves process was choose the assets that they were going to go audit. So everybody came up with their list. Then they used Post-its and markers on a whiteboard. And they all sat together in a room, get off your computers, off email, and they rank ordered the assets that they thought they needed to go evaluate. And then the team came back and reported out, right? In the space of about a 90-minute meeting, they claimed, and I have no reason not to believe them, although I don't have an independent measure, that they were able to get a decision in 75 minutes, start to finish, that had normally taken them months and literally hundreds of emails to get done. And the people in the process actually liked it better. Okay? And the problem, of course, here is it's not that these aren't smart people. They're super smart. But when you're dealing with uncertainty, and this is probably my main message today, is that electronically mediated communication, like email and Slack and chat and so on and so forth, which we all tend to devolve to, is enormously inefficient. Better to get people in a room or on a Zoom meeting and allow that to be processed face to face. Okay. So a couple pieces of advice here, and then I will stop and take questions, is probably the biggest thing that comes out of all the research done in this framework is if you go back to my box here, right, between factory and studio work, so the relation, the main insight from all this research is you need to match the frequency of your meetings. When people go individual work to their studio work, you need that to the amount of uncertainty in your environment, okay? If you think about agile software development, right, that typically preaches a daily stand-up meeting. We're going to come out of our cubes where we're writing software. We're going to go come together once a day to talk about our project. We're going to go back. And that appears to be a good cadence daily for the average software project. I can tell you in some of the incidents that I've worked on, post-major accidents, sometimes the team actually checks in every, right? And the reason for that is the world is changing so fast that there's new information that we need that is best distributed through a really quick meeting, okay? So number one big sort of takeaway is, particularly in a crisis situation, you need to match the frequency of meetings to the speed with which your world is changing. Most of our worlds are changing really fast right now, and we're learning new stuff, probably every day and some every hour about how we're going to have to manage moving forward, okay? Chances are you are not meeting frequently enough. Okay, and that is definitely the case with what Jane was dealing with, is every 2 weeks for that leadership team meeting when their environment was changing every day, not frequently enough. And of course, what that means is all that uncertainty processing is the email, which is an enormously inefficient way to do that. Now, you're probably thinking, I can't believe this guy from MIT is telling me that I need more meetings. In fact, if your meetings are well designed and you take a lot of that work that's happening on email and you move a well-designed meeting, it actually will increase your efficiency quite significantly. Okay? Number two, we are big proponents of what we call visual management here. That's a whole other part of this research stream. There's a lot of online sort of visual repositories for issues and issue tracking that you can use. Trello is super simple. Obeya, there's a bunch of ones out there, and we don't have a particular favorite. But if you want to have effective meetings, thing to think about is, can I get all the issues that we need to cover in a meeting on some kind of visual representation in advance? Can they be prioritized in advance? And then, organize the meeting so that you can go through them as quickly as possible. And then finally, and that I think we all can benefit from is, what's the purpose of a meeting? Well, using the simplified definition that we use around here, meetings are good for two things, which is to solve problems and decisions. And so if you want to sort of measure the value of a meeting, at least as a simple way, and it's not perfect, but it's a good start, think of measuring meeting productivity by the volume of decision made and problem solved, right? Tracking the funnel of decisions that you're making is a really useful activity. And in my world, what should have happened for Jane is that they should have had a meeting every day or two. She could have brought that issue to a meeting. It would have gotten prioritized relative to the other activities, and then she could have gotten an answer much faster rather than going through all the sort of pain and suffering of the email and waiting a week that she really couldn't afford to lose to get the answer back. Okay. All right. Let me stop there. I think that's about 40 minutes. And Jose, I would be very happy to take some questions if there are any from the audience.
Okay. All right. So a question that I had right away when you're talking about the situation with Jane, right, which is like a comedy of errors, if you will, and I've experienced it myself. There's a question of trust, right? Because if you trust an employee to make a right decision, and you mentioned this when you were talking about, the questions you have, do I know the best way? When do I ask for help? That implies a certain trust, right? So how do you balance that with the need to consult, to make sure you're doing things right? Granted, there are different levels of decision making, and so what's kind of like it's called the sweet spot on decision making, so that you do empower your employees, because empowerment is a big issue as well. And when do you really need to consult and come to a consensus?
Yeah, so that's a great question, Jose, and I'm really glad you brought that up. And it goes back to the definition, which I went through relatively quickly, of the trigger, right? Because what a trigger is basically a rule that says, when have I exceeded my authority in whatever it might be, and I need to raise my hand and tell my boss, right? And that's actually another part that was probably broken a little bit in this sort of comedy of errors. I think that's a perfect description, which is it wasn't at all clear to Jane sort of what the trigger was on her budget authority, right? This turned out that not have been an enormously expensive investment. And so, you might say that, like, this is ridiculous. You have to go to the leadership team to spend, X $1,000. Jane should be allowed to do that on her own. But the real benefit here, and this is why I think your question is so great, is once you define more explicitly triggers, like, okay, Jane, you're authorized up to this dollar figure, or you can manage your project yourself as long as you're, within this fraction of on schedule, it allows you to have a very direct lever to control that trade-off between empowerment and control. And so, if you ask me where's the sweet spot, is it $10,000 or 10%? I have no idea. But I do know that once we have that explicit lever, you can start to learn how much latitude you're willing to give your people. And once you have that rule in place, you can begin to experiment with it so that you can find that sweet spot over time. And that's kind of where the dynamics come in. Right. So, you can imagine, if Jane's the junior member of the leadership team, okay, so maybe her budget authority is going to be pretty low for a while, and she does have to escalate a lot. But if we track those decisions and it turns out we learn that, Jane's actually got pretty good acumen and most of her projects work out, then with experience, we can start to relax that trigger and give her a little bit more space based on those experiments. And the other thing is, too, is that, if it turns out that the leadership team just has more than they can process, right? Imagine they're meeting for an hour and they still can't get everything done. Well, that might also be a signal that, hey, maybe we need those triggers a little bit because we're escalating sort of more things into this than we have the sort of attention to. So it's a long-winded answer to your question, but I think it's a really valuable thing if you can do it to make those escalation criteria, those triggers, really clear, because now it becomes a design variable that the team can regulate up or down to make sure that they're getting the right level of actions so that they can get the issues that they need to target, not sort of mired in minutia that, frankly, we should be able to go do. It's a great question.
Okay, so then that kind of fits, the schematic of the factory versus the studio, where if you kind of set those triggers kind of like as a factory, right? It's a decision-making factory, right? You have some good triggers. Let's say it's a matter of a budget. Under $5,000, take care of it.
Exactly.
But that's almost like a factory process.
And in fact, sometimes, sorry to interrupt, they can be more subjective. So one of the things that I do with my instructors in our teaching programs is, we get evaluations back from the various courses about whether they went well or went poorly. And when my team and I review the evaluations, we put them in three categories, which is, there's some people that do great. We don't need to talk about those. Some people that have minor issues, but we feel like the instructor is more than capable on their own of dealing with those. And then some that we want to escalate and we want sort of direct feedback about, what they're doing. Right. And that basically is, I can't say it's $5,000 or whatever, but it's a kind of subjective assessment that here are issues that we think people could be left to their own recognizance. And here are ones that we want to kind of be actively involved in your remedial action because we think it's sufficiently serious. And then, of course, over time, as people demonstrate to us that they're good at solving their own problems, then we can move more people back into that category. So we've thought it's been a really powerful framework just to help us think about where we put our scarce leadership time in terms of making the programs better.
Okay. I know this is a big question, but of course it's the question. Then so can you comment on what happens with COVID, post-COVID, and the whole decision-making, meetings, email, Zoom? How's that going to transform? Per at least your crystal ball, if you were going to give it some.
So it's a great question, and I don't think my crystal ball is any less foggy than anybody else's. But as I said at the beginning, and I'm glad you brought this up, I think this problem that you saw in Jane's case has been in most organizations already. It's just a little bit easier to see because we're dealing with more uncertainty now, in the COVID world that we've done before. But at least in my view, in the organizations that I work with, we're overly relying on email to process ambiguity. We're not meeting frequently enough. The meetings they were typically too long and kind of circuitous and not particularly sort of well organized. And so, what I hope is that if people can sort of figure out what meetings are good for and design them in that light, that is good for all seasons. Now, once we get to post-COVID and things stabilize, maybe that meeting frequency goes down because the world's not changing as rapidly as it was before. But I still think, having good escalation criteria and having that meeting frequency match the speed with which your environment is changing is something that I hope people learn from this, that they can sort of transfer back and forth. I mean, I'll give you sort of one other example that is a sort of classic place where I think this gets screwed up is if you're in an organization that is sort of tech oriented and you're doing project reviews, with senior management and project teams, in most cases, the meetings you're having are too infrequent and too long. And what I mean by that is that, for most project reviews, it happens at the end of phase gates or it happens every quarter. Historically, those meetings are really long and excruciating. And basically what it is it's, the project team going through slide after slide after slide after slide, telling you that everything's fine. And only in the last 5 minutes is it revealed, but, oh yeah, except there's like this fundamental problem with the technology that's going to sacrifice the whole project if we're not careful. Typically much better check-ins, much more rapid check-ins that are shorter and with clear escalation criteria can make those far more effective. And for those of you that are from the software world, that's the main lesson of Agile, right? Which is not the main, but one of the big lessons of Agile is simply more rapid check-ins that are better designed can allow you to iterate and learn far more rapidly than a kind of more traditional waterfall thing where we're not checking in with each other nearly as soon enough.
Mm-hmm. And so to follow up on that, actually, I saw a question that's very pertinent here. So, there's post-COVID, there'll be some changes, but maybe, let me know if you agree with this thought. Maybe there will be an optimization in the scheduling of meetings, especially when you have situations where decision makers are in different time zones, they're not in the same office. And before, this might actually have delayed the decision because, he's going to be here next week from Chicago and so on and so forth, as opposed to now, it's almost like default, it's like Zoom meeting. Boom. Do you see that kind of like as a silver lining in all this?
Yeah, I think it's such a good point because, I imagine, I don't know, but I think certainly we're having these discussions at MIT. I imagine other places that even when we go back, we probably don't need to be in the office as much as we did before. And I think remote work is almost certainly going to be a bigger part of our lives than it was before. But the great opportunity there, which is exactly the one that you cite, is I think we can kind of go back to a clean sheet of paper in terms of check-in frequency. Because I think you're exactly right. Back when we sort of relied more on face-to-face, if my boss, the dean, is out on a trip around the world, well, okay, I won't raise an issue until, next dean's meeting or something like that, just like Jane, or I'm going to send him an email, which is probably more my default. But yeah, now that we're kind of more accustomed to remote work, you're right. We could have an hour-long or a half-hour-long check-in meeting with the leadership team every day. Yes, it's going to be a little bit challenging with time zones, but if we can make that a really efficient kind of issue processing thing, then people can get answers to questions much more rapidly. And it just allows you to redirect the ship much more, sort of agilely or nimbly than you could before. So I totally agree that this is a great opportunity to revisit that meeting frequency. And the other thing is that, there's another kind of really interesting dynamic. So one of the organizations we've worked with a lot that has really a fabulous dynamic work design system now is Broad Institute, which is the genomics organization that's now part of MIT. Once we helped them get their act together on a good morning production scheduling meeting, it took hundreds of emails a day out of their system. And the reason for that is if I know I can get my answer in 24 hours, I don't need to send an email, right? 24 is enough, right? If I know that we're not going to have a face-to-face meeting for a week, then the email frequency tends to go up dramatically. And again, you get all the sort of associated inefficiency. So yeah, use the move to remote work and Zoom as a way to revisit some kind of fundamentals. Because the other thing that I think happens is we are so tied to habits in organizations. Most of what happens in an organization is habitual. How many of you have a weekly staff meeting? Probably you do it just because it's weekly and you've been doing it, since, before the internet or whatever. No one really thought about it. Is weekly the right frequency? Maybe, for strategic issues, it might be too frequent. For operational issues, it's probably not frequent enough, but we just do it because that's what we've always done, or every 2 weeks or monthly reviews or whatever it might be. So yeah, use this as an opportunity to think consciously and revisit that.
Mm-hmm. And so the point you brought about Broad is very much related to one of the questions here that I also worked in R&D myself, and there's a question here asking what suits R&D type of activity. Is it the serial, is it the studio approach? And I'd certainly like to hear that question, because we had our challenges. R&D, there's some things that are rather broad and conceptual, so you might say, okay, kind of that's the studio piece of it. However, if you stick to that approach too much, you lose the kind of the agile, let's say, step by step practicality of okay, all right, so we did the big picture, now let's get into the minutia. So what would you say is a let's say
another great question. And I think, so first off, I think, at least our contention is that all processes are a mix of individual work and, sort of collaborative work. Even the most high-end innovation, sort of effort, the most cutting-edge new technologies, right? You probably have scientists or engineers or technicians that need some time to go back to their offices and think. And so, think of it as not, we need to pick factory or studio, but the question is, how quickly do we cycle in between those two things? But I think also, the point that you raised, which I completely agree with, is that cycling may have to itself be a little bit dynamic and change as we get to different stages of the project. And I think Agile is an interesting example here, and this is a place where the example from Agile software development can be a little bit misinterpreted. Which is in software development, essentially prototype builds is roughly speaking free. Right, you can do to build overnight, or you can send it, and so you can get a really rapid iteration between work and daily builds, and sometimes in more tough tech or physical technologies, sometimes testing just doesn't allow that, right? So, if you're developing a new vaccine, right, there is just a certain time required to go do a clinical trial, and yes, we're getting results as we go. So it may well be the case that meeting frequency needs to be adjusted for different phases of the process. And the guide that I would give you here is basically you need a meeting when there's new information, right? So if, we're in the midst of a clinical trial and we're in the setup phase and there's no information from the field, you don't need to meet every day necessarily, because there's no uncertainty to process, right? On the other hand, if you're getting results from the field, really rapidly, you may need to meet every day or twice a day or whatever. The other thing that I would say to follow that is, and again, we went through this part kind of speedily, is think of both triggers and checks, right? A check basically represents that frequency with which we're checking in. And in the early phases of a project, right, you're probably going to rely mostly on checks because the work is sufficiently uncertain. Like, hey, Jose, let's have a chat, you and I every day. I'll tell you what I did. You tell me what we did. We compare notes. We go back to work. As the product or the service starts to come together, you'll be able to put more rules in place that we call triggers that say, hey, as long as this is within these bounds, we don't need to meet. But boy, the moment you cross one of these things, well, you better call us right away because we need to meet. And so the nature of what catalyzes the meeting, whether it's a check or a trigger, may also evolve, right? So if you think of a construction project, in the later phases, that should be very standard work. But, if you come across, a major departure from, the design or some part of the site that you didn't understand, that should trigger you to kind of escalate, and we need an all hands meeting quickly. And I can tell you, this is a problem I see over and over again, is that if those escalation criteria are not clear, people will discover a problem and they'll think to themselves like, I don't really want to tell Jose that I screwed up. So I'll bet if I work on it for 24 hours, I can solve the problem. And then I don't have to deal with the embarrassment of that. It gets back to the trust issue you raised later.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Our experience is if there's a clear rule, like if you're 5% out of the budget authority, tell your boss, people are much more likely to use that escalation, and then information sharing tends to go up.
Mm-hmm. And trust is a two-way thing. I mean, you trust your line manager to do something, but then the line manager should trust his or her superior to be able to go to them and with a problem. Right? It works both ways. And so in a company that, let's say, and oh boy, some of these questions I'm like, oh yes, I can't say the name of the company, but don't want to embarrass anybody. I've had some experiences with in my career, and so what do you recommend on how to change a legacy mentality, something that's 40, 50 years, like you were saying, we always have the meetings Monday at 10 a.m. or something. That's just the way it is, no matter what's going on. So what are some
It's a great question. So let me tell you what not to do first. Don't go back to your home organization and say, I heard this punk professor from MIT tell us that we need to do this, so MIT must be right. Let's change everything at once. That's been proven over and over again not to work. What I would say is start small, and nothing succeeds like success, which is if you can find a place where through your own actions you can change behavior. And if people are starting to look over your shoulder like, wow, that team's really operating well, I think that's the a good place to start generally. But even more specifically, is if you want to experiment with this and you're looking for a place to start, look at your email inbox, right? If you find a particular process that generates, multiple email threads that have dozens and dozens of emails attached to it, much like Jane's case, so budget requests or whatever, that's usually a super productive place to start. And more generally, if you see that ineffective iteration where it just takes you email after email, to reach a decision on something that it just feels like should take, be able to do much faster, try, just ask your colleagues, like, let's just try it for 4 weeks, right? Can we meet every day or every couple of days or every week or whatever? And let's just prioritize and try to get these issues sorted face to face or Zoom to face, rather than iterate these on emails. And I can almost promise you that you will like the results better. And if you can get kind of an initial success, some points on the board, if you will, then it becomes much easier to propagate that. So if we go back to my colleagues at Broad, their most hated meeting every morning was what they called this production managers meeting. And that was because they didn't get any work done in the meeting because it was all done by email during the course of the day. So just changing the design of that meeting so that it was very focused, clear priorities, just made all the difference in the world. And then once that kind of calmed down, it was much easier to propagate the ideas to the rest of the organization.
Mm-hmm. And in a situation where you have meetings and you have agreed on a certain frequency of meetings and so on and so forth, and some of them are face-to-face, some of them are phone calls, some of them are Zoom. And then you get into the overload of meetings. So we have a question on that topic, which is any practical tips to make sure that at least the meetings that you do have are productive, and what to do with meetings that are not productive.
Yeah, so it's a great question. So number one, I think this is a big failure mode, is all meetings, or certainly most meetings, should be thought of as one step in a larger work process. So if you think about, I have work moving through the organization, right? The meeting is a step where uncertainty resolved or money is allocated or whatever. So I think the first thing is just to get clear, like, what's the purpose of the meeting? Why are we having it, right? So that weekly staff meeting, if you think of it from a process point of view, what should happen is issues come in, problems, decisions that need to be made, and then stuff comes out, decisions or solutions. And I think number one, kind of just in the habitual way that we organize, people lose sight of the fact that, meetings actually have a purpose. I know it's a little hard to think sometimes because we all go to a lot of bad meetings. So I think just getting clear, even draw a simple diagram on your whiteboard in the meeting room or via Zoom or whatever of what are the inputs to this meeting, what are we supposed to do, and what are the outputs? And then I think the other thing to do is, and this is a trick I learned from my colleague, Don Kiefer, is, just for a week or two, keep track of how many decisions were actually made in that meeting and how many problems were actually solved. And if the meeting is really bad, I will be willing to bet that what you'll find is you spend hours and hours and hours and actually almost nothing comes out of it. And I think sometimes when people see those data, that can help them sort of revisit that, oh, geez, maybe there's a better way to organize our time.
Great. All right. Well, thank you so much. Right, we could spend some more time here, but we're going to move on to our next video. Thank you so much, Nelson, for joining us today.
It's my pleasure. Thank you all very much, and thanks for staying on.